And Dr. Bibi Pirayesh is an educational therapist who recognized the connection between learning differences and social justice. Get ready for an impassioned talk from Bibi that will take you from her childhood in Iran to George Floyd's death this summer. All right, let's bring on now our third speaker, Dr. Bibi Pirayesh. Hi, Bibi.
I don't know how I came to work with kids with learning disabilities for a living. I didn't have any learning challenges as a child. In fact, I thrived in school. It was the only place where life made sense. But I knew from a very young age that this was not the case for everyone. I would watch my classmates struggle, parents and teachers get mad and frustrated. I have a distinct memory of my father, who was a businessman and who, unlike my teacher mother, hated school, to draw with me. As I watched him struggle to draw simple shapes, houses, trees, things that I could have drawn at a really, really young age, I was suddenly faced with a harsh realization. We are not all born the same. We don't all have the same abilities. And that meant that we don't all have the same chances in life. It was a really heavy truth to come to realize at such a young age. How could God create such a world? And I remember as I put my father's hand on mine and asked him to follow my pencil, making a decision that the only way to make the world more fair is if we helped each other. But what I didn't realize in that moment when my father fell off his pedestal is that the world is not made by a God with ADHD who wasn't paying attention. The differences between us are not a mistake, they're by design. It took years of schooling in cognitive and neuroscience for me to really come to understand that the human brain learns through contrast. We learn through difference. It's our man-made values that we assign to those differences that create the injustices that we see. I was born in 1978 in Iran. And like all the children born in that year, I was called a child of the revolution. In school, in addition to learning math and science, I was taught to push my fist into the air and to chant "Death to America." This, I was taught, was being a revolutionary. But just as it didn't take long for me to see the hypocrisy in a school system that praises me for an ability and shames another for not having that ability, it didn't take long for me to realize that the patriarchal, heteronormative, hegemonic system that was teaching me to be a revolutionary was untrue. It was a lot for a little girl to have to process. At 10, my parents moved my brother and I to the US. Now in school, I was being asked to put my hand on my chest and to pledge allegiance to the same country that I had sworn to fight with my last dying breath. The difference was incomprehensible. And yet, these are the types of differences that we ask and expect bicultural children to process all the time as we expect them to assimilate into a new culture. At 15, my parents separated. My mother was so worried about the way that I was processing the divorce that she wanted me to see a therapist. We were first-generation immigrants and we didn't have money for therapy, but she was insistent and she'd borrowed money for me to have just this one session. I remember a white, middle-aged, blonde woman with permed hair and flowery, silky clothes that seemed to flow like a kite every time she gestured. She asked me if I knew what cognitive dissonance is. My brain was used to quickly decoding and translating words, but these words were too big even for my practice brain. She explained to me that this is something that happens to children whose parents argue, and she went on to tell me what the term means. As I sat there listening to her, I wondered, how could this woman have a PhD? And does she know what being bicultural means, or what immigration means? She was the second so-called expert that I had gone to see in my time in America. The first had been a school psychologist that my mom had asked to test me to see if I could qualify for the gifted program at our public school. After the test, she told my mother that even though she understands why she thinks I might be gifted, my scores were high, that my vocabulary, after just 1 year of learning English, wasn't high enough to put me into the district's category. At the time, I just brushed that off, but now, sitting across from this therapist, I made another decision. The people that we go to as experts to tell us what's right and wrong with us were just as confused as the men in power in Iran. Because the truth was that even though she couldn't see it, and even though the school psychologist would not have been able to quantify it, I knew exactly what cognitive dissonance is. I knew it in my bones. I hadn't thought about the term cognitive dissonance or the slight therapist with the flowery clothes for a really, really long time, until this past summer, when, like so many of you, I watched that video of a police officer pushing his knee into the neck of George Floyd until he took his last breaths. As I watched that video in shock, in dissonance, I thought about all the Black and brown children across our country who we teach to trust the police because they're there to protect and to serve them. I thought about all the children I grew up with in Iran who were taught that they are a great force against US imperialism and Western colonialism, all while their childhoods are being stolen from them. And I thought about all the children in my practice and the millions of children across our country with learning disabilities who are told that the people pathologizing and labeling them are actually there to care and support them. And I thought about the therapist with the flowery clothes and whether she ever came to understand that the ability to sit with difference, to sit with tension, to understand perspective, and how one man's terrorist can be another man's freedom fighter is not cognitive dissonance, it's wisdom. Since then, I've thought a lot about the way in which we are now finally able to hear and to listen to the perspective and the gift that the voices of Black and brown people are offering us about our systems. And I've been wondering if the ground is also now finally ripe enough for us to listen to and to receive the gift that differently wired children have to offer us about our education system. In 2020, the US federal government budgeted over $13 billion for the education of the nearly 7 million children with learning disabilities in our country. And yet, special education continues to fall short of our democratic ideals, and it continues to be a problem of equity in terms of race, socioeconomic status, disability rights, and so forth. All of this has become even more apparent in the face of our current pandemic. In her book, Elusive Justice, the critical educator Thea Renda Abu El-Hajj suggests that perhaps it's the way that we view difference that is creating the problems that we have. Difference, she suggests, in our meritocratic positivist system is equivalent to deficit. And so no movement, no advocacy, no legislation, no amount of money is ever going to make any difference because the problem is epistemological, it's ideological. It requires us to go back to the roots and to ask ourselves, why are we so afraid of difference? The answer usually comes back to power. Today, after 3 degrees in neuroscience, education, and psychology, I am one of the experts that parents like my mother seek out when they're worried about their child. My job as an educational therapist is to help children come to terms with their diagnosis. My job is to also help parents and families navigate the special education system, and to the extent that it's possible, to help teachers learn how to differentiate better for more inclusive classrooms. But the truth is, if I were to ask my 15-year-old self, or my 10-year-old self, or my 7-year-old self, she would tell me to push my fist up into the air and to call out the hypocrisy in our field and to demand change. Because the truth is, she knows as well as I know now that it's not the children, it's never been the children, they are not the ones in need of a diagnosis. We are, with our systems of inequity. So I want to ask you today, as parents, as teachers, as therapists, as experts, as anyone who has been charged with the sacred task of listening to and raising children, I want you to ask yourself, how do I hold up ideologies that are all about pathologizing kids in the name of care and support. 2 years ago, on a cold spring morning that I will never forget, I got a call that my father had been taken to the hospital. By the time I got there, he was gone. As I held his face in my hands, my father was vulnerable again, just as he had been all those years ago in our living room. In that moment, there was no bad or good, right or wrong. There was no pedestal. There was no A or F. There was just love and gratitude. As I drove home that day, I realized that my father, in being vulnerable with me, had helped me to lose my faith in the world and to gain it back again. This is learning. This is wisdom. Every human being is capable of it. All of us help each other with it because we don't see eye to eye, because of the tensions that we fear so much. The critical educator, Paulo Freire, says that education is where we live democracy. My favorite quote from John Dewey, the father of progressive education in the United States, is, "Democracy is born anew every generation, and education is its midwife." So I want to ask you today to see if you can begin to see, in an act of faith and healing, that the children in our classrooms, the ones in our families, in our practice, the ones who struggle, the ones who don't fit, the ones that we so passionately want to save and to fix, were actually put there for a reason. What if we saw and received the gift that they bear? What if we gave up on our fervent march to fix them and allowed instead for them to challenge and to fix the sameness of our minds? Thank you.
Bibi, that was absolutely incredible. You know that I love the way that your mind works. And when I read your script for the first time, and I know you did 2 different versions of it, yes. And this first version, I said, you have to go with this one. And the women in the chat were blown away. And a bunch of them were saying, this is a TED Talk. And I couldn't agree more. So incredible job. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.